Today is June 22nd, 2026. I'm walking through Poznan, Poland, and today we are going to Zambia. Not physically, but forensically, because something happened in the corridors of American foreign policy that most people in the world do not know about. And I need you to understand it, not emotionally, forensically. If you are new to this channel, welcome. Hit subscribe, because what we do here is not commentary. We follow the money. We trace the architecture. We name the system. And today, the system has a name, and it is ugly. Let's follow the money all the way to the top. Let's trace it. Now, let's begin. April 30th, 2026. That date was a deadline. Not a political deadline, not a budget deadline, a biological one. Because on that date, 1.3 million Zambians living with HIV were waiting to find out whether their treatment would continue, whether their antiretroviral medication, the medication that keeps the virus from becoming a death sentence, would still be funded the following month. And the answer to that question was not sitting inside a hospital. It was not sitting inside a public health office. It was sitting inside a minerals negotiation. Think about that. 1.3 million human lives suspended inside a copper deal. That is where we are beginning today. How PEPFAR was built to do exactly this. To understand what is happening in Zambia right now, you have to go back 23 years.
Mr. Speaker, Vice President Cheney, members of Congress, distinguished citizens and fellow citizens. Every year, by law and by custom, we meet here to consider the state of the Union. This year we gather in this chamber deeply aware of decisive days that lie ahead. You and I serve our country in a time of great consequence. During this session of Congress, we have the duty to reform domestic programs vital to our country. We have the opportunity to save millions of lives abroad from a terrible disease. We will work for a prosperity that is broadly shared, and we will answer every danger and every enemy that threatens the American people.
The year is 2003. George W. Bush is President of the United States. And in his State of the Union address, he announces what will become one of the most significant foreign aid programs in modern history. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. The program is framed as a moral response to the HIV crisis ravaging sub-Saharan Africa. And by certain metrics, the framing holds. Over the next 2 decades, the US government will claim that PEPFAR has saved more than 26 million lives across the continent. 26 million. That number is real. I want you to hold it, because it is going to mean something different by the end of this episode. Now, stay with me. What PEPFAR also did, quietly, structurally, over those same 23 years, was build a system of total dependency. In Zambia specifically, PEPFAR came to fund approximately 80% of the entire national HIV response. Not 20%, not 50%, 80%. Let me be precise about what that means in practice. It means that the Zambian government's own domestic health budget, its own Ministry of Health, its own national pharmaceutical procurement, none of it was scaled to cover HIV treatment. Because for 2 decades, it did not need to be. The money came from Washington. Year after year, program after program. The infrastructure was built around that external funding. The clinics, the supply chains, the health worker salaries, the data systems. All of it oriented toward PEPFAR's architecture. Now I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think about this carefully. When you fund 80% of a country's response to its most catastrophic disease for 23 years, what do you actually own? You own the leverage. You don't own it formally. There's no contract that says leverage, but the structure creates the condition. The dependency is the instrument. And an instrument in the right hands at the right moment is a weapon. The right moment came in 2025. What the State Department memorandum actually says. A U.S. State Department Memorandum of Understanding. That is the document at the center of this investigation. The two sides, Washington and Lusaka, are negotiating a 5-year health deal to replace the existing PEPFAR agreement, which expires on April 30th, 2026. Now, let us go through what is actually inside this proposed agreement, because this is where the investigation becomes uncomfortable. Clause 1. The termination trigger. The proposed MOU states that all healthcare funding will be immediately discontinued if no deal is reached by the deadline. Not suspended, not renegotiated. Discontinued. Immediately. Pause on that. In a country where 80% of HIV treatment funding comes from this single source, immediately discontinued. That is not a negotiation clause. That is a detonator. Clause 2. The mineral access demand. Washington is requiring, as a condition of the health deal, preferential access to Zambia's mineral resources, specifically copper, lithium, cobalt. Now understand what preferential access means in this context. It means that American companies would have priority rights over companies from any other country, over Chinese companies, over European companies, over companies from the African continent itself. American firms go first. American firms get the terms. And why these minerals specifically? Because copper is the backbone of electrical infrastructure. Lithium powers the batteries in every electric vehicle and every energy storage system in the green transition. Cobalt is a critical component in the same batteries. The United States is trying to secure its supply chain for the next 30 years of technological dominance, and Zambia is sitting on it. So the structure of this deal is, give us your minerals and your people will not die. I will let that sentence exist for a moment. Clause 3. The health data demand. This is the part of this story that most mainstream coverage missed entirely, and it may be the most consequential element of the entire agreement. Washington is requesting 10 years of access to Zambia's health data, national health data, HIV treatment data, patient outcome data, pharmaceutical response data. But the funding being offered covers only 5 years. Read that again. 10 years of your data, 5 years of your money. Now, why does health data matter at that scale? Health data at the national population level is one of the most valuable commercial assets in the modern world. Pharmaceutical companies use population-level data to develop new drugs, to run clinical trials, to identify genetic markers, to calibrate dosage effectiveness across different demographic cohorts, to patent treatments. Health data of 1.3 million HIV-positive patients in a sub-Saharan African population. That is not administrative record-keeping. That is a research asset worth hundreds of millions of dollars in pharmaceutical development value. And the proposed deal offers Zambia no guaranteed share of any profit that results from it. No royalty structure, no joint development clause, no benefit-sharing mechanism of any kind. You give us your copper, you give us your lithium, you give us 10 years of your most sensitive biological data, and if something profitable comes out of it, a vaccine, a drug, a patent, that belongs to us. That is the deal on the table. Clause 4. The funding reduction. In 2025, the United States provided $367 million to Zambia for HIV programs alone. The proposed New Deal offers $320 million for all health programs in 2026. Not just HIV, everything. And that figure would decline each subsequent year. So the offer is less money, covering more conditions, with a built-in annual decrease in exchange for minerals and a decade of biological data. How aid becomes architecture becomes leverage. I need to slow down here and show you the system underneath the system, because what we are looking at in Zambia is not an accident. It is not the result of one administration's cruelty or one negotiator's overreach. It is the outcome of a structure that was designed, whether consciously or not, to produce exactly this kind of moment. Here is how the mechanism works. A donor country enters a sovereign nation with a humanitarian program. The program is real. The lives saved are real. The gratitude is real. Over time, the recipient government adjusts its own budget priorities around the existence of that funding. Domestic health spending shifts toward other sectors. The HIV response becomes a PEPFAR program, not a Zambian program. The institutional knowledge, the supply chains, the data infrastructure, all of it is built inside the donor's architecture, not the recipient's. 20 years later, the donor government changes, or its strategic priorities change, or the global economy shifts in a direction that makes a mineral-rich country's resources suddenly critical. And at that precise moment, the humanitarian program becomes a negotiating instrument. Because the question is no longer, will you sign this deal? The question is, will you let your people die if you don't? That is a different kind of negotiation. That is coercion wearing the face of aid. Now I want you to hear something important, because this is the wound principle of this investigation. The wound is not what is happening right now. The wound is what was happening the whole time. The moment PEPFAR funded 80% of Zambia's HIV response, the leverage was created. It did not need to be activated. It simply needed to exist. And every year that Zambia did not build its own domestic funding capacity, for understandable reasons, economic reasons, structural reasons, the leverage deepened. So when the deadline came, when the memorandum landed on the table, the trap had already been built. Here is my prediction, and I want you to come back to this comment section after you have watched this episode and tell me whether you agree. I believe this deal, in its current form, is the template. Not just for Zambia, not just for Africa. I believe the United States and potentially other major powers after it has identified a formula. Find countries with critical mineral reserves. Find existing points of humanitarian dependency and use the second as leverage to access the first. Zambia is not an isolated case. Zambia is a case study. Zimbabwe walked away from a similar negotiation. Kenya went to court over the data clause, and there will be more. The question is whether the African Union as a collective body will respond to this formula as a systemic threat, or whether each country will be forced to face it alone, one deadline at a time. What do you think? Zimbabwe, Kenya, the pattern becomes visible. I said Zambia is a case study. Let me show you the other files. Zimbabwe. In late 2025, Zimbabwe walked away from a similar negotiation with the United States over health program funding. The specific point of collapse was the health data clause. The Zimbabwean government refused to sign an agreement that gave Washington access to its national health data without a clear benefit-sharing framework. Zimbabwe walked, and the funding consequences were immediate. Now understand what it takes for a government, any government, to walk away from a deal when the alternative is a collapse in healthcare funding. That is not a political statement. That is a crisis decision. You walk away because what is on the table is worse than what happens when you walk. Think about what that tells you about the terms. Kenya. In Kenya, it was civil society that sounded the alarm. Activists and health advocates took the Kenyan government to court specifically over the health data clause in a US health funding agreement. They argued that a sovereign government does not have the right to hand over national population health data to a foreign government without the explicit informed consent of its citizens, without a benefit-sharing framework, without any guarantee of return. The Kenyan case made the data extraction mechanism visible in a way that government-to-government negotiations rarely do. And what it revealed is this: the data clause is not an administrative condition. It is a commercial extraction mechanism inserted into a humanitarian agreement aimed at a pharmaceutical development pipeline that will generate profits in which the source population will have no share. The pattern: Zimbabwe, Kenya, Zambia. These are not isolated negotiations. These are instances of a formula. The formula is: identify a country with strategic mineral reserves. Identify an existing humanitarian dependency. Construct a deal in which one is conditioned on the other. Add a data extraction clause that extends the value capture beyond the deal's funding period. Set a hard deadline with an immediate termination trigger. Negotiate bilaterally, not multilaterally, so each country faces the pressure alone. That is the architecture, and it is being deployed systematically.
What happens to 1.3 million people when a deal falls through?
Let me bring this back to bodies, because that is what this is ultimately about. Zambia has one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world. Approximately 10% of the adult population is living with the virus. That is not a statistic that exists in isolation. That is a number that represents households, that represents parents, that represents children born to HIV-positive mothers who are surviving today because of antiretroviral treatment. Antiretroviral therapy, ART, does not cure HIV. It suppresses the viral load to undetectable levels. It prevents transmission. It prevents progression to AIDS. It is a daily medication, and it requires an unbroken supply chain. When you disrupt the supply of antiretroviral medication, even for weeks, you create drug resistance. Resistance means the existing medication stops working, and a patient who develops drug resistance faces a significantly more difficult treatment pathway, more expensive, less effective, and often unavailable at the level of infrastructure that exists in sub-Saharan Africa. So, immediate discontinuation of funding does not just mean people stop getting medicine. It means for a significant percentage of those 1.3 million people, the medicine they have been taking stops working permanently. That is irreversible harm. And it was written as a termination clause into a memorandum of understanding. When President Trump began his second term, he froze foreign aid across the board. PEPFAR was caught in that freeze, and for the first time in the 23-year history of the program, fewer people received treatment than the year before. The program that had saved 26 million lives registered a net negative for the first time. That precedent matters because it told Zambia and every other PEPFAR-dependent country that the freeze was a capability demonstration. It was proof that the tap could be turned off. And it was turned off before the negotiation, not during it. That is not coincidence. That is sequencing.
Here is what this investigation has shown us. The villain in this story is not a person. It is not Donald Trump. It is not the State Department negotiator who drafted the memorandum. It is not even the pharmaceutical companies waiting for the data. The villain is the architecture. The architecture of aid dependency built over 23 years that made it possible to use human survival as a negotiating variable. The architecture that built Zambia's HIV response inside a foreign government's program instead of inside Zambia's own sovereign health infrastructure. The architecture that never included a sunset clause for dependency, that never built a transition pathway to domestic funding, that was renewed year after year in a form that deepened the leverage rather than dismantling it. And I want to be precise about one more thing. This is not unique to PEPFAR. This is not unique to America.
This is the operating logic of conditional aid as a foreign policy instrument. The conditions change. The donor changes. The sector changes. But the mechanism is identical. Create dependency, then activate it at a strategic moment. The question that every African government must now answer is a structural one. Not how do we survive this deal, but how do we build a health system that can never be held hostage again? That is the harder question, and it is the only one that matters.
What does strategic awareness look like from here? First, the African Union must classify health infrastructure as a sovereign security issue, not a development issue, a security issue. Because what Zambia is experiencing is not a funding dispute, it is a sovereignty test. Second, the data clause. The 10 years of data for 5 years of funding structure must be treated as a standard extraction mechanism that will appear in every future bilateral health agreement with a major power. Every African government needs a legal framework for health data sovereignty before the next negotiation begins. Third, domestic HIV funding must be treated as a non-negotiable budget floor, not a residual line item. Zambia's domestic health budget must grow to absorb what PEPFAR currently covers, not tomorrow, but on a timeline, with milestones. Because the alternative is permanent vulnerability to exactly this kind of deadline. Fourth, the PEPFAR dependency model across the continent, Angola, Tanzania, Uganda, South Africa, Mozambique, all of them with significant PEPFAR exposure, needs to be treated as a collective risk, not a country-by-country problem. The formula is already visible. The next deadline is already being set somewhere. The truth is always in the transactions, and the transaction here is very clear. Your minerals, your data, your people's lives, in exchange for continued access to medicine that should never have been conditioned on a deal in the first place. That is the hostage structure, and it has been 23 years in the making. If you watched this episode to the end, you now know something that most people in the world do not know. And knowledge in this context is not passive. Send this episode to one person today. One person who needs to understand how the system actually works. Not how it is described, how it works. The investigation continues. The next file is already open. The truth is in the transactions. Follow the money. You are watching Historic Capital.